I put the cord just right. So fingers
Because
crossed.
right now it's working fine.
Fingers crossed on the mic. And we are live. Jose, we're just talking about my microphone, which tends to cut out. So hopefully that doesn't happen this time. Greetings, everybody. It's Friday. Happy New Year, Jose.
Happy New Year, Brian, and Happy New Year to everyone that is listening.
Jose and I were just talking about what's going on out there in the world. And boy, whew, that's a good way to wake yourself up in the morning, because here in Colorado, it's 8 o'clock. And you get up, you're like, okay, and it's like, no, I'm ready to go now. So we're going to tackle our topic today with vigor, which is hazard analysis. Yeah. So we are live on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube to bring to you today's topic, which is hazard analysis. And so please, everybody, as you're getting on here, say hello, type in your name and where you're from. Like I said here, I'm out in Colorado. Jose is down in Southern Florida. How's the weather down there, by the way?
Oh my goodness, has been just beautiful. These, I will say 2 or 3 weeks in a row. It's just excellent. Humidity is very low. We have most of the time we have been under freezing temperatures for Southeast Florida, below 70.
So what is it here in Colorado? In Loveland, Colorado, it's 24 degrees. So it's a bit chilly out.
Oh my. No, that's not for me.
No, yeah, the dog went out and did his business very quickly this morning. So that's a side benefit of that. That's for sure.
Yeah, I bet.
Oh, hey, what's interesting here is one of the things, and if people want this, please email me and I'll send this to you. One of the things, Jose, that FDA puts out, and they've updated this, is all of their recalls and warning letters and citations, right? So if FDA goes into a plant and gives the plant a 483 for failures, FDA publishes that information on what they wrote those plants up for. Now they take out all the details of, confidential information, but the company and all these type of things. So I've gone back and reanalyzed that for 2020. Some really interesting stuff in there. But for our topic today, the top five is hazard analysis. The other things in the top 5, which is kind of interesting, are things around your plant. So people following GMPs and condition of the plant and, seeing pest activity, things like that. So you can't forget about those. But on the food safety side, with your food safety plan, hazard analysis is in the top 5.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised. And most likely, Brian, if we go back in time into that information about 483s from FDA, most likely you are going to find the same thing with the seafood HACCP. And if we go and do some kind of a research, FSIS, USDA, most likely we will have findings about the effectiveness of the hazard analysis.
Absolutely. Before we start diving into this too deeply, Jose, it's time for our drink.
Yes.
Did you bring your tea today?
Oh, yes. Here is my cup of tea.
I love that cup. Beautiful.
That is very good.
Beautiful. So again, and this is a fun thing here. Let's see if this works here. So I can do a ticker here across the bottom. Ah, look at that. Hazard analysis running across the bottom.
Oh yeah, I can see it. Oh, that's nice.
Isn't that nice? We're getting fancy here. We are getting fancy at Food Safety Chat. So are you ready to dive in, sir?
Yes. Okay, so look at what I prepared for today, Brian. So when we discuss about chatting about the hazard analysis today, I said, well, I mean, everybody's going to say, well, that is, the typical hazard analysis, and that is, we're going to be talking about the same thing over and over, and most likely it's going to be the same topic as we have seen in any presentation, course, training, whatever. And I said, we should be doing this in a way to make sure that we go into some details that maybe people is missing in those classes or courses or whatever is the understanding. So one of the things that I would like to say before we start getting into hazard analysis is, and I have some notes for today.
Mhm.
So the first one that I have here is that we need to remember that before we set up any kind of a hazard analysis, we must be working, the company and the facility must be working under sanitary conditions. And I need
Mhm.
to highlight these two words because that's how it is written in the law. And the law says that if we are not working under sanitary conditions, two things will happen. Number one, working under in unsanitary conditions is prohibited by law. And remember that the food law is a criminal law, so
Yeah.
carries criminal consequences. But number two, anyone working under insanitary conditions, the products are automatically identified as adulterated or misbranded. So
Yeah.
that's the other thing that is extremely important. And remember your hazard class. If you do not have your GNPs in place before you try to attempt your hazard analysis, it's not going to work.
Good point. Very good point. That's a perfect grounding for this because so to put it in layman's term, right, is you can have the best food safety plan in the world, but if you're producing your product in a dirty barn, it doesn't matter.
It
It
doesn't
doesn't
matter.
matter.
Yep. Yep.
Absolutely right. Got to have that
So
framework. Please.
so after that, Brian, because we already discussed in sanitary conditions, the other thing is, okay, so if I'm working under insanitary conditions, my products are going to be considered adulterated or misbranded by default. The misbranding is about proper labeling and making sure that we declare everything. So I'm going to, for a second, not talk about misbranding. Let me concentrate on adulteration. So
Mhm.
again, I'm going back to the definition of adulteration and I'm going to say, okay, so what is the definition? So look at this. If we are working under insanitary conditions, our products could be adulterated with number one, filth,
Mhm.
and number two, a hazard that will cause illness or injury.
Yeah. And keep in mind too,
So,
what Jose is bringing up here for everybody who's listening to this is terms like filth are legal terms, right? These
yes.
are definitions in the law.
Yep. Yep. And when I'm saying filth, for example, could be if your product contains, I don't know, maybe not the product. I remember the picture that we used during the preventive control for animal food class. There is a picture there that shows the shirt of an employee with a little bit of food grade grease. Well, that is an indication of working under insanitary conditions.
Hmm.
Insect parts, a lot of insect parts in some ingredient that we're receiving that is working under insanitary conditions. Most likely, that is not going to cause illness or injury, but the product is adulterated
Yeah.
because there is something that is not part of the food, in this
Yeah.
case, the ingredient that we're buying. So look at this, Brian. With those two things, understanding filth and understanding hazards, the GNPs is how, and I'm going to say the FDA for right now, but the GNPs is how FDA or any other GFSI standard is looking for people to set up, develop, implement programs to maintain sanitary conditions.
Hmm.
And those requirements are the minimum requirements. So, can you go above and beyond whatever is written there? Of course, you can do it. Can you go below that? No, you cannot. Okay, so prerequisite programs is basically the definition of going above the minimum GMPs,
Right. Yeah. And a good way to
right?
think about it too is so you've got this minimum threshold, which is a great way to put it, Jose. So you've got this minimum threshold that you cannot go below, right? The government is saying anything below this isn't something that it's fit to eat, right? So once FDA says, oh, you've gone below this line, you produce product that's adulterated, it's done, right? That product is not fit for human consumption. done deal, right? It's you're there's no way out of that. So if you ever
Yeah.
hear FDA say that, you know what you've got.
So originally, by the initial design, and this is my guess, I'm just now thinking about the whole system as a food safety system, GMPs divided in GMPs and HACCP, because with GMPs, what we're trying to do is to control filth. And with the HACCP, with the HACCP approach, with the hazard analysis in this case, what we're trying is to separate the hazards from the filth under the adulterants of the food.
Mm.
And that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I like it. That's a great way to think about it. Good idea.
So look at this. So if that is true, which I believe it is, okay, and maybe someone in the audience may correct me or provide any other point of view. But assuming that that is correct, look at this difference between preventive controls and HACCP. In HACCP, a critical control point by definition is a step of the process where we are going to set up a control measure.
Right.
In preventive controls, what the regulation requires is that you define the controls that you're going to put in place for the hazards, and then define where or how you are going to set up that control. So by definition, the control is not linked to a step of the process, it's linked to the hazard that will cause illness or injury.
Yeah, so it's a wider view.
It's a wider view. And you
Mhm.
know what, Brian? The during this last weekend, I got a copy of the Codex Alimentarius 2020 guidelines, the new
Mm,
one.
nice.
Oh my goodness! And that's, guidelines is so much aligned with the preventive controls that you have no idea.
Mm,
In that document, Brian, when I saw the template for the hazard analysis, you don't have the last column, the CCP column for to answer yes or no. It's not part of the hazard analysis anymore.
mm,
What about that? So they
interesting.
are basically saying, you know what? The preventive controls approach makes more sense because it's about separating filth from the hazards.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, I mean, this is great. I mean, this is really showing why it's so important to have this base and why the hazard analysis is so important. One of the things that I've seen, Jose, when I go out and I look at people's food safety plans, and for convenience, we'll talk about food safety plans for this, is that they take their old HACCP plan and they look at their old hazard analysis and they say, it's pretty good. I think I can just use my old hazard analysis and just kind of tweak it a little bit and I'll be good. Huge mistake. Do you agree?
I agree 100%.
Yeah, because one of the things with the hazard analysis that FDA then says now, and this is a huge step up with FSMA, is okay. You show that you have a hazard here for this step or this ingredient, let's say salmonella, and then the next thing that FDA says is show me the documentation and the evidence that you came to this conclusion with. And people go, oh, well, I just kind of know, right? You have to have the documentation. I found this in the Bad Bug book. Here is my research online for recalls for salmonella for this ingredient. Here is my analysis based upon this research paper from Cornell or wherever, right? You have to have the backup. And a lot of people get written up for that because they just think it's common knowledge.
Yeah.
And FSMA requires that documentation.
And now that you're mentioning that, Brian, look at this. We go to a HACCP class. We take the HACCP course. We receive the certificate. We take a preventive controls class. We attend the class and we get the certificate. So now during the hazard analysis, we are supposed to identify hazards that are specific to our process, environment, ingredients, people, activities, equipment, facility, and so on. Really? Because my point now is, have you had any kind of training on how to determine which are the different sources and which are the different hazards that may impact your processing operations? Because that is not something that you get when you take preventive controls or HACCP. You just learn about the methodology, but
Yeah.
you're not learning about hazards. Is
Yeah,
that
it's a good
right?
point.
And
It's a
that is
very good point.
exactly the reason why you and me, when we start helping people, we start saying, well, can I see your flow chart? Can I see your hazard analysis? What are the hazards here?
Exactly. And I think a really good way, and people get confused on this, and I tend to break this out. So I'd be curious to see how you do this. In the hazard analysis, I like to break it into two sections. People tend to blend these together, but I like them separate, right? So to your point, right, we're going through the whole methodology. We're just talking about the hazard analysis, Pete. So we have the flow charts and blah, blah, blah. So I like to break it up into an ingredient hazard analysis and a process hazard analysis. People
Me
blend
too.
those and they get confused. So the example I use is this: is milk, raw milk. Let's say you're a dairy. Raw milk coming in has hazards, right? It's not pasteurized. It's raw. It's coming in the truck. If you drink it, you're probably going to get sick, right? There's listeria floating around in there, salmonella, who knows what,
Yeah.
right? It's not
Yeah.
fit for human consumption. That's a hazard in the ingredient itself. So
Yes.
the first step in the dairy plant is receiving, right? So you're bringing the milk in and you're putting it in a silo. A cooled silo, right? You're keeping it at 40 degrees or less. Why?
Or
You're,
below.
you're preventing those bacteria that are there from getting into a log phase and going out of control. Because your pasteurizer has a 5 log reduction, it's not going to kill everything. So the more bacteria, the more gets through, right? It's going to cause issues.
Yes.
So the process keeps it cool to control the hazard present in the ingredient, right? And if you don't separate those two things out, it gets really muddy really, really fast.
Yeah. Yep. That's absolutely right. You know, pasteurization, any mild thermal processing is designed to reduce certain amount of logs of in whatever is the bacteria of concern in this case. So if you want to achieve zero and you're expecting, and I'm going to say a number, we're going to have 10 bacteria here. Okay, I need zero. Very well. I'm going to design a pasteurization process that is going to reduce from 10 to zero. And I'm going to tell you, Bryan, you need to maintain the temperature like this or above, and you need to have that temperature for this amount of time. Done. What about if you start instead of 10, you start with 11 or 12 or 20 or 25? Well, the process is not going to reduce to zero. And,
Yeah.
and I'm saying zero. We will never get zero. But I
No.
mean, my point is a reduction.
Right.
So if we do not maintain the right GMPs in place and our product is not low enough in load of whatever is the hazard at the beginning, maybe our controls are not going to be effective.
Yeah. Yeah. A good way to think about it is just a percentage. Let's say that, to your point, 1% survive, right? And that's the way nature works. Bacteria are very tenacious, right? Some are always going to survive. You're going to have spores or what have you. Something's going to get through. So to your
Yeah.
point, right? If you've got 10, you've got 0.1. Nothing's going to survive. You got 100. Oh, now you've got one. You got 1,000. Now you got 10, right? And it just goes and goes and goes and goes. And and with bacteria, right? You're not talking about 100 or 1,000 per mil. You're talking 10 to the 6, 10 to the 7, right?
Yeah.
You're talking a lot of bacteria. So you need to keep that as low as possible. Now, this all circles back to what you were talking about earlier, right? If you don't have a plant that you keep clean and you don't have good sanitation in place and you don't have good processes and training and GMPs and that all contributes to making that process less and less and less efficient.
And at the end, we already mentioned this, but you know what caught my attention? I was reading these new Codex Alimentarius guidelines, And it caught my attention. I read the entire document by GNPs and HACCP. So in many places, Brian, I can tell you I did not count them, but I will say that 3 or 4 different places throughout the entire document, Codex Elementarius is pushing people to say, if you don't have the right background to do hazard analysis, don't do it. Look for help.
Nice. Well, and that's, I'm sure you see this in your business because I see it in mine too, right? We go to the PCQI course and we go through, and the trainer is going through the information, and you're up there doing the training, and me as a student is like, oh, this is amazing. I totally understand this. This makes perfect sense. I understand how to do a hazard analysis for omelets. I got this down pat. But then you go back to your plant, right? And your plant is not the instruction manual. It never is, right? The chances of you making omelets, very small.
Yeah.
The chances of you making omelets how they do it in the manual, 0, right?
Yeah.
So now you're sitting at your desk going, oh my God, where do I start, right? Where do I start, right? And so that's a very good lesson. I think it's something that we need to emphasize is don't feel like you have to do this on your own and you need to carry the entire burden, right? There's all kinds of resources and data and everything else. And this circles back to what I was saying earlier. When FDA says, all right, you've identified this as a hazard, how do you know, right? You need to show them that you know. And if you don't, you're going to have a lot of problems. And this is something, this is a second point for me, I think it's super, super important, is you need to be able to explain this, right? One of the things we've heard since we were kids was if you want to truly understand something, you have to teach it, right? If you can explain it to somebody else who knows nothing about it, and you can explain it in simple terms and put it in a context that they can go, oh, okay, that makes sense. You understand it, right? You need to be able to do that. So when FDA comes into your plant and they're sitting opposite of the table of you and they ask you a question, you need to be able to teach them on why you do it the way you do it, because not everybody's the same. So the importance is not
very important.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important, right? You have to be able to sit there and say, oh, absolutely, Mr. FDA investigator, here is why we came to the conclusion on why these hazards exist in raw milk. And here's the resources I used to came to that conclusion. And further in our plan, you're going to see how we control these things. Now FDA is shaking their head and saying, yeah, okay, I understand. I see why you're doing these things. Because part of this too, Jose, is you're going to, in your hazard analysis, include things. There may be things that you look at from a hazard standpoint that are not hazards for you. You have an amazing system, an amazing program, and it's not a risk for you. When FDA comes in and they expect to see that risk and you don't have it, now you have to work twice as hard to explain. So you better understand why you don't have that as a risk.
Yeah.
So having a food safety plan that is spread across all the documentation in your plant in folders and binders and a little bit of it here and a little bit of it here. And, oh, let me show you the records for this. And I think the hazard analysis over, that's bad, right? You need to have something where you can step through it and tell your story from beginning to end so FDA can understand it and then provide the details to them when they ask for it. A lot of people don't get that.
Yep. And again, you may get the HACCP training, you may get the preventive control training. You are trained on the methodology on how to do that, but you're not getting trained on hazards. And when the FDA shows up and they say, why you are not having, and I'm going to say for milk, why you do not have listeria as your environmental hazard.
Right. So, and let's say that you are working in a plant with aseptic fillers and everything is completely, tied up. You could make the case to FDA. This is completely hypothetical, right? You could make the case to FDA that here's our process. Here's how it works. Everything is sealed. Everything is controlled. Everything is CIP. There's no reason for us to do, let's say, listeria environmental sampling. Right? Now, I'm not recommending that. Don't get that. Don't complete hypothetical, right?
I know.
Yeah, big disclaimer there. But you could have a case to justify those. And another good example in the milk industry is for the, under HACCP for a long, long, long time, is antibiotics was looked at as a hazard in the milk, as a chemical hazard. Okay, antibiotics that the cows have been treated because they were sick, and that gets into the milk supply, and that's a hazard we need to control. But people have moved away from that. Well, why? Is that no longer a hazard? Well, it never comes in the plant because you do testing at receipt, and if it fails the test, you reject it immediately. And there's all kinds of research and data out there showing that the impact and the actual residue from antibiotics in the milk supply now is very, very small. The chances of it happening are minimal. And are there any recorded illnesses or adverse reactions in the public to that hazard? My research hasn't found any, right? And maybe the plant hasn't found any. Is that now a hazard? Most plants have said, no, it's not a hazard. So they've removed that based upon the controls and the evidence. And that's the important part, Jose. And that's, I think, part of what we're trying to pound home here is your hazard analysis needs to be based on evidence. And you need to present your case just like in a court and show that
exactly right. Exactly right, Bryan. I could not agree more on that specific topic.
Yep. Now, so part of this then, so if I'm, and please everyone, part of this is just not Jose and us talking about this issue. And you can tell we enjoy talking about this, but the reason we do these live streams is to help you as well. So if you have questions, please, type them in here and we are more than happy. We will stop talking and we will answer your question exactly like Becky did just now. And thank you, Becky. That was absolutely perfect timing. So we have a question here, Jose. From Becky, which is, what are your thoughts on listing prerequisite programs as justification? List document number or just the program title?
Oh, that's a very good one. So, Becky, I'm going to start the explanation the same way that we started the chat this morning. If you are going to be using your prerequisite programs as part of your justification to say, no, a hazard is not significant, is not going to cause illness or injury, that GNP that you are listing, that prerequisite program that you are mentioning by document number or by the program title or whatever you wish, okay, is now controlling a hazard, not filth. And that is exactly why I started this conversation with Bryan this way this morning, because the way that the law is structured right now, the food safety system is structured right now, some GNPs are controlling hazards, not just filth. And depending on the effectiveness of your GNP, you may say, okay, so this hazard is controlled by the GNP, is not going to be a hazard in my hazard analysis. So I'm going to be asking you, if I'm the FDA, I'm going to be asking you, really, can you please show me now the validation of that GNP? Because otherwise, if you don't have a validated GNP control for that hazard, you have no clue if the hazard is controlled or not effectively.
Yep. So if I'm FDA, right, so that's kind of the same thoughts I was having as well. So we'll keep it the GMP example. So, all right, this hazard is controlled by my GMPs. What's FDA going to do, right? They're going to look for your documentation. They're going to look for your training. They're going to look for that proof that you're controlling that hazard. And then they're going to go out on the floor, right? And they're going to watch really, really closely.
Yep.
And if they see people who aren't washing their hands when they go in the plant, or they see people who aren't wearing their hair knot correctly, or anything involved with GMPs, you're getting a 43 because you are saying that my foundation and what I'm relying on is the implementation to control the hazard by the GMPs. And FDA says, okay, that's fine. If you fail, you fail. Right? You're in trouble.
If you fail, your products are adulterated, you're working under insanitary conditions, and that is a prohibited act in the law.
Right. So a good way to think about it, and the way I always break it up in my food safety plans, is your prerequisites and then your preventive controls. Right. So your preventive controls are the next level up. Your prerequisite programs, Becky, are the base of your pyramid. They're everything that you do to make sure that your product, to Jose's point, is not adulterated, not misbranded, not having filth, all these type of things, right? And then those build up to the other programs. So a good example of this is, let's say, allergen control, right? So that's a big preventive control for a lot of facilities. And
Yes.
under that, FDA is going to say, well, how do you control this? Well, I have these base programs. I have GMPs where people, don't cross-contaminate, and we have color coding program for our brushes, and we have batch control and tracing, and we don't use rework, blah, blah, blah. But
Okay.
to Jose's point, FDA will say, okay, well, that's all well and good. How do you verify and validate that this is working? Right? Well, we do random finished product testing once a week for allergens. We're looking for the presence of allergens that shouldn't be there. We do allergen swabs before we start up to make sure, to verify that our cleaning worked, right? And so we have those results. Would you like to see those testing results, Mr. FDA investigator? Well, yes, I would like to see those. And then you walk them through that path, right? You are providing the evidence that what you're doing is effective.
That's right. That's exactly right. And at that point, Bryan, if you think about what we're talking right now, at that point, that control, even though that it may be under the GNP umbrella or the prerequisite program, by default, by definition, is a preventive control.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Now, so one of the things, now, Becky, let us know, please, if that answered your question. If you have additional questions, please follow up and let us know.
Yeah.
By the way, this question part here is during the live part. We're doing exactly what we do right now. We answer these questions live. But as you can see here on the screen, right, we have our email addresses here. So we're more than happy to answer questions after. And if you want a copy of that analysis that I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast on what FDA is citing people for in 18, 19, and 20, just let me know. I'll send that to you. Happy to share that. And Jose, I want to get a copy of the Codex, new Codex 2020?
Okay.
Yeah,
I believe I can search for the link again and send you the link.
Yeah, that'd be great. So if anybody else wants that, please email Jose, and I'm sure he'd be happy to send that to you as well.
Sure.
So
it's a public document.
Good. Yeah, very good information. I didn't even know it was out yet.
Yeah.
So Jose, what resources? So we've been talking about the justification piece, and I'm sure people are asking this now, is okay, that's great, guys, but what documentation, what references can I use to show FDA to justify my hazard analysis decisions?
Okay, so and with this answer, Bryan, I'm going to be answering Becky's question because he just replied again.
Yes.
Good. With that comment, is the receiving a controlled by a prerequisite program or controlled by a preventive control? Let me say a preventive control or control measure in HACCP. And this is not that difficult, Becky, because by definition, whenever we are controlling something that will cause illness or injury, which is a definition of a hazard, is a biological, chemical, or physical hazard that has the potential to cause illness or injury, okay, we need that control measure that is going to be called control measure in HACCP for a significant hazard, which in this case, in the case of Bryan, is going to be for the milk. It's going to be the receiving of the raw milk with antibiotics. Antibiotics are not part of milk. Is that a hazard that will cause illness or injury? Well, let me tell you, and Bryan, correct me, I'm not the expert here, but if you drink one glass of milk that contains a little bit of a residue of an antibiotic, you are not going to get sick at all. Zero. Nothing is going to happen. However, the problem here, Becky, is that the definition of food does not include drugs. As soon as the milk contains any residue of an antibiotic, you are not receiving milk. You are receiving a drug. And you cannot produce food with drugs.
Right.
It's a prohibited act.
Right, which is why in that hazard analysis, as part of that prerequisite program, those dairy plants still test for antibiotic residue.
Yes. And most likely, I agree that in that case, it should be a I mean, you can call it a critical control point, a control measure at the receiving step, or you can call that a process preventive control at the receiving step.
Right. So, yeah. So, for your question, Becky, would you call receiving temperature control a prerequisite program or something else? Right. So, as you're going through the hazard analysis, so it's like raw milk, hazard, listeria, and then it's asking you, is this something that needs control? Yes. Now, this is where you need to think about it in two different terms. You think about it as the risk inherent
Yeah.
in the ingredient, right? Which is why if you're a dairy plant buying milk, you have supplier programs, right? You want to work with your milk
Yes.
suppliers and your co-op to make sure the milk is the highest quality that you can get coming in and it meets regulatory standards and all these type of things. So there's a
Yes.
prerequisite program on the ingredient as part of your supply chain, right? Here's my list of approved suppliers for milk. Here's their last rating from the local LEO, like in Pennsylvania, the lead, the laboratory guys. And here are our random audits that we do of the milk supply. On the process side, the control is the cooled maintenance of the raw milk prior to pasteurization to control the hazard of the listeria that is inherent in the milk. So it's two levels that you're looking at that, right? So yes, that is temperature control, right? Which is why you take the temperature of the milk coming in at the truck and you maintain the temperature of the milk in the silo. Ingredient hazard analysis, process hazard analysis, both part of your prerequisite programs, the bottom of that pyramid that you're using to control that hazard, right? And then
Yep.
further down the line, pasteurization then is your control step within that process. And so this is kind of interesting, Jose, as we kind of go through this. It's a little off topic, but as I help people put together food safety plans now, I don't really list CCPs anymore, right? It's the preventive and prerequisite controls associated with that, right? So I think that's a big leap for people as they're going through this and a bit of a confusion as they're setting these things up and going through their hazard analysis.
You know what, Brian? I'm going to use another example, and you are saying we're going off topic. I don't think I were going to talking exactly about the hazard analysis. So
Yeah.
look at this. Look at this. In my experience with milk, okay, the other bullet point I have here for our conversation today is about following the traditional methodology for performing a hazard analysis or following the all inclusive. And this is something that not many people know about. This is part of the seafood HACCP. When I'm teaching seafood HACCP, there is a section where the FDA explains people that they may go with the traditional method or the all inclusive. And the FDA recommends the all inclusive. But you know what? When I'm training preventive controls or the FSIS, HACCP, or whatever, we never mention that in those trainings. So people is not aware that there are two ways to go through the hazard analysis. So the traditional is, for example, you identify that that milk is an allergen. I'm going to keep on using milk. The milk is an allergen at the receiving, and your preventive allergen preventive control is going to be at the labeling step. You're going to make sure that the jar of the of the milk is going to say, well, this contains milk, and basically that's it. That's how you alert anyone with milk allergies that, well, you cannot drink this. Um, but let me use another example. Let's say that when we're receiving milk, we could be receiving, I mean, some of the hazard, can I say, listeria, of course, salmonella, and eventually E. coli in milk. Is that possible?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So look at this. We are at the receiving step, and we have a tanker truck that is supposed to have the milk at 40, and we're going to take a sample, which is a typical process of receiving of the milk. Take a sample to check for antibiotic residues.
Mm-hmm.
No residue, we're fine. Okay, unload the tanker truck. So now look at this. I'm going to put at the receiving of the milk, and I'm going to grab one, E. coli. Okay, so fine, E. coli. I'm going to put E. coli at the receiving of the milk. Under the traditional approach, I'm not going to put that E. coli again in my flow chart, in my hazard analysis, until we reach the pasteurization process.
Mhm.
Because at the pasteurization step is where we're going to have a critical control point
Right.
or a process preventive control.
Right.
However, when the FDA in the seafood has a recommends the use of the all-inclusive, what we're supposed to be doing? Well, we identified E. coli at the receiving, and the answer is, are we controlling E. coli at the receiving? No, we're
Mhm.
controlling that later in the process. Okay,
Right.
you transfer that hazard to the next step. And the next
Ah,
step could be, for example, the storage. And you're going to say, in my storage, am I controlling E. coli? And you're going to say, nope. So you transfer that hazard again to the next step and so on until you reach to the pasteurization step. And at from that point on, E. coli is controlled.
interesting.
Now look at
Yeah.
this. What is the
Mhm.
good thing about doing that? That you are going to see that, for example, when the guy that is hooking up the hose to the back of the tanker truck and connected the other end to the pump, so the hose, the pump, the pipes that will take that raw milk with E. coli to the raw tank, all of that is contaminated.
Yeah.
And you need to set up a cleaning procedure to take care of E. coli to prevent cross contamination between one load that may have a bigger, one truck that may have a bigger load of E. coli than the next truck, or
Yeah.
so on.
And to
So
keep
all of those,
oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
and all of those GNPs are actually controlling cross contamination.
Yeah. And yeah, what I was going to throw in there too then is, right, this goes back to our bioburden conversation relative to the pasteurizer, right? Part of this then is to keep that contamination level as low as possible so that your pasteurizer is doing a good job of knocking it down.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Exactly right.
Yep. So let's see. Maurizio has a question here. Cool name. I like that name. Milk is milk anyway, even with residue, in providing the residues are not above the minimum levels. Don't you think so? Not quite sure what he's getting at here. So I think what he's saying is, so you have a test, and so residues for antibiotics in milk super sensitive, right? Micrograms per mil type levels. So if there's any residue below that, yeah, it may be there. I mean, so it's still safe, right? You're not detecting it. It's below the detection limit of the test. Part of this, and this is part of the problem in looking at these different hazard analysis. And so I think it's a good point, Maurizio, that you bring up, is the testing limits associated with these different risks that you're looking at. These things are becoming more and more sensitive, right? So we used to talk about, on the chemistry side, parts per million. Now we talk about parts per billion, right? So at parts per million, we couldn't see it. Now at parts per billion, we can. It's like, oh, this is now here. Is this a risk, right? And so we're seeing this more and more, right? So allergen testing becomes more and more sensitive. We are looking at, let's say, for example, soy testing. If you're looking at that with a swab methodology or something like this, they're able to detect at 5 parts per million for the test. Well, according to research, so through FARP at University of Nebraska, whatever, let's say hypothetically, I don't know the number off the top of my head. Let's say that FARP says that for soy, the trigger for anaphylaxis in people is around 10 ppms, but you're able to test at 5. So what happens in between, right?
Yep.
And you have a positive test at 5, but it's below 10. Is that still a hazard, right? And so it can get muddied when you look at these things from that standpoint, which is why, going back again, circling back to why it's so important to have the documentation so you can have these conversations with FDA on why you chose something over something else.
And I mean, 100% with you on that, Bryan. The other thing is understanding some terminology in the food business, because in the case of antibiotics, if you have presence of antibiotics, again, like like we were explaining, Becky, a few minutes ago, is that now you have a drug present in a food product, and that is adulteration by default.
Yeah. And that's kind of the in some ways the catch-22 we're in, right? Because
Yeah.
if it's there, it's there.
Yep, that's it. And
Yeah.
and no matter what is the tolerance, he's there, and he's a drug. So, I mean, it's about doing the right things. I mean, like we were saying a few minutes before, Brian, if you drink milk that contains a little bit of antibiotic, is that going to cause illness or injury in you? No, not one glass. But I
Mhm.
mean, if there is no controls about that and the industry goes crazy and everybody's drinking milk all the time with antibiotics, yes, that is a concern.
Right. Well, that also gets back to dosage, right? So if you drink 5 glasses of milk a day, you're getting
Also,
your high.
yeah, the dosage.
Yep, it gets very confusing. So we're coming up on 45 minutes. Wow, this really flew. I'm so happy we're back doing this over the holidays. The last couple of weeks, I missed this. I love having these conversations. So Jose, kind of what I want to close on this then is for people to really kind of let them know that resource side again, right? Because that is so important. FDA has done us a great favor by putting together what they call Appendix 1, right? And this goes through it and gives FDA's thoughts around, for chemical, physical, and microbiological, some of the hazards they expect to see in different types of products. Now, keep in mind, this is guidance, right? This is FDA's opinion on things that you should think about. That's all it is. You don't have to include those in your plan. But if you don't, back to what we talked about before, you need to explain your rationale and have your documentation to back that up. Appendix 1, great source to go to. FDA's Bad Bug Book will teach you about the different threats associated with micro and different elements there as well too. Recall data. Look at recall data from FDA and see what are those things out there where there are lots of issues, right? Yes. If you work in produce, should you be looking at E. coli? Yeah, right? All right. You have to, right? That data is going to show you where the risks are. Those three things out there are really, really good ones. Any other suggestions, Jose, on what type of documentation people can use to justify their hazard analysis?
Well, you know that besides the ones you mentioned, I will also highly recommend the use of the RASFF, RASFF, Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed in Europe. So you go to their portal, and they have a very, very nice way to search through hazards and things that may happen in products besides the FDA webpage. So that's a good resource.
Nice. I like that. That's a great one. So excellent questions, everybody. Let's see. One other comment here from Mauricio. All over the world, there are MRLs, and the milk is milk, not a drug when the limit is respected. Yeah, of course, if you can't detect it, then you're good to go. So with that, we try and keep these around 45 minutes, so they're not too long for everybody. And I think this was a perfect conversation. Again, we do this every Friday. So next week at the same time, so 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. East Coast time, Jose's time, we get on and talk about these discussions. Part of this is for everyone, right? This is just not so that we can talk. So if you have questions or things that you want us to talk about, please email us at the addresses here and give us ideas for topics. What are the things that you would like to know about food safety? And we're happy to talk about those on the show. And if enough people are interested in it, that becomes a topic just like this. So thanks again, everybody. I love it. Jose, any other questions here for closing?
No, I believe you are done.
Absolutely. So thank you, my friend. Awesome topic. Everybody, hazard analysis, super important for your food safety plan. You got to spend a lot of time on it to make it right, and don't forget, include your justification. So with that, we'll sign off. Thanks again, Jose. We'll talk soon.
Bye, Brian. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.